sin, about guilt and shame and fear, God was punishing me. I cried myself to sleep at night, feeling so guilty, asking God for forgiveness. This is a place where you eat, sleep, breathe Jesus. Hello everyone. Today I want to walk you through my spiritual journey from Christianity to atheism. This story has spanned my entire life up to the present, so I'm going to do my best to just speak about the essentials and the defining moments so that this video is not 10 hours long. Just know that there are a lot of details and concrete examples of things that I'm omitting for the sake of time. To give you kind of a relative idea of the length of each of the phases that I kind of went through, I was a Christian for the first 21-ish years of my life, and then from around that time until around 28 years old, I was what I would call a tentative deist, and then I've been an atheist now for the past year and a half. So at this point, I've had time to reflect on my childhood, to reflect on my college years, and I've been able to disentangle and solidify my impressions and ideas from those parts of my life. So we'll start with my childhood. I was raised by Christian parents, but religion was not a big part of our daily life. It was compartmentalized. We were the church on Sundays, but lived the rest of your life every other day of the week, kind of Christian. We went to church occasionally, a Baptist church, and we would pray before meals, but only at my grandparents' house. And we celebrated the religious meaning of holidays, as well as the secular meaning. And that was really the extent of religious things in daily life. The rest of the week, the rest of life was much more secular. I was not sheltered from violent or adult themes in music or movies or TV or just media in general. My parents cussed. I was not homeschooled. Very normal secular life at home on the not Sundays. I'm really trying here to show a distinction between what you might be used to seeing on social media, the trendy Christian kind of life with homeschooling and praying and cutesy decorations that say, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," and buying expensive things that you virtue signal to your neighbors because you're helping save all the orphans in Uganda. That was not my childhood experience with Christianity. Even the church the churches that we went to were much more solemn and serious affairs. We had hymn books and a piano. You dressed nice. You took church seriously. There was more talk of your depravity than God's grace, more mention of hell than heaven, and more emphasis on renunciation than on the joy, joy, joy down in your heart. That was my home experience with religion. And I think if this had been my only exposure to Christianity, I would have ended up a lot better off, both cognitively, emotionally, but it wasn't. I went to a private Christian school from kindergarten until 8th grade. This wasn't like my parents' original plan to send me to a Christian school, but when it was time for me to go to kindergarten, they looked around at the public schools and they were really displeased about the academic rigor of these schools. My dad was under the impression, probably correctly, that I would spend the entire kindergarten year playing instead of learning anything useful or doing anything useful. So started to look at the other options, and there were really only two other options in the area. One was a Catholic school and one was a Protestant school, a Christian Calvinist school. My dad sure as hell was not going to send me to a Catholic school. And so the only other option then was the Calvinist Christian school. And it was rigorous. It was very old school, very traditional. So they were okay with that option. And that's where I went to school for the next 9 years. There's obviously a whole slew of experiences that I could talk about attending the school. But I'm really going to try and stick to just the main things to give you an idea, and specifically in religion. So like I said, this school was Calvinist. It was also fundamentalist, which, if you're not familiar, that basically means you take the Bible literally as written. It is true. snakes really talk, water really turns to wine, angels wrestle with men, and Jesus really dies and comes back to life. I can distinctly remember in 7th or 8th grade a history textbook with a picture depicting Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with all the animals and dinosaurs. To most people that probably sound really insane, but this was my experience. Evolution was discussed only derisively as something stupid or evil that non-Christians believed. We had a Bible class as one of our subjects every year, and we spent an extensive amount of time memorizing passages from the Bible, reading the stories, interpreting the stories, talking about how to apply the principles to your life. I'm not sure if there really was this focus or if I just really have selective memory, but it really seemed like we learned a lot about the intricacies of the Jewish faith. Like, we would celebrate Passover, and I can remember multiple different times of learning about the structure of the temple, like the different levels of the temple and what kinds of people were allowed in each level and what kind of sacrifices were supposed to be made in each level, and just so much about the temple. I don't know if that's normal for other Christians. If you happen to be not Calvinist or grew up not Calvinist or even Calvinist, let me know if there was this really big focus on learning about the temple, because my memory says we did stuff with the temple all the time. We prayed every day, we did daily devotions, we would have a chapel service every Wednesday where we would sing hymns, and then the principal or the pastor from the church next door would give a lesson or give a sermon after we sang. The school was really traditional. We had corporal punishment, so you were spanked or forced to run laps if you got in trouble. There was kind of like a one-room schoolhouse vibe because multiple grades would be in one room with one teacher. So for example, 1st and 2nd graders would be in one room with one teacher, 3rd and 4th graders, and so on, all the way up through 8th grade. We had things like climbing ropes to the top of the gymnasium, which, yeah, that was kind of my experience at school. It was still pretty solemn. There was still a big focus on guilt and sin, a little bit, some sprinkles of some joy and forgiveness every little bit, but pretty similar, honestly, to what I got from my church and home life. So far I've been describing the external inputs into my life as a child, and now I kind of want to sum all of this up into like the conclusions that I came to, the ideas that I had, and just the internal effects of all of these inputs. That's not to say that this is in any way deterministic. I had my own personality and my own role to play in integrating the different things that I was getting from the church and from school and from home, but the material I was given was obviously integral in the kinds of conclusions that were open to coming to. To really give you an idea of the impact of this kind of childhood, I want to talk about a couple different dimensions. I want to talk about my relationship or perceived relationship with God or Jesus. I want to talk about my approach to the world at large, to reality in general, my relationship with other people, and then my relationship with myself. So we'll start by talking about my relationship with God or Jesus. It was pretty negative. I viewed God as this supreme authority who was always watching me, who was intimately aware of my thoughts, my actions, and he was there, and it was his job to judge me, and specifically to judge me as lacking, as less than. My relationship with God was predominantly about sin, about guilt and shame and fear. I don't particularly remember thinking about hell or being afraid of hell or punishment in the afterlife. I wasn't fixated on that. However, I was fixated on sin and guilt in the present and on disappointing God and the perceived pain that I was causing God from my sin in the present. There was one other aspect of my relationship with God during this period, and that was kind of as like a source of strength or support when going through really hard things that you couldn't control. So for example, I would pray to God and feel less scared when for example, if my parents were fighting, or if there were tornadoes or thunderstorms, and I was just really scared, and I would feel less scared if I prayed and I believed that God was in control. Overall, though, my relationship with God was predominantly negative. You had this authority figure on the one hand who was angry and jealous and judging, and then you had, on the other hand, yourself, who is depraved and pitiable and pathetic, who should be serving this authority. So next is my approach to the world at large and to reality. It was obviously very mystical. I viewed God as a real and ever-present actor in the world, so that any event that happened, any person that you had an interaction with, there was always some secret meaning for you to figure out behind that event or that interaction with a person. There was always something there for you to learn from that God was trying to teach you through whatever it was that happened. For example, there were multiple things like this, but I'll give you one example. At the end of 6th grade, my best friend, his parents decided to take him out of school and homeschool him for 7th and 8th grade. And I was devastated by this. I didn't have a lot of friends, so losing the one good friend that you had in school was hard. But what I learned from this and how I conceptualized what was happening was that God was punishing me. God saw my heart, and he knew that I cared about my best friend and I loved my best friend more than I cared about God. I had this attachment to worldly things and worldly friendships, and God was saying, listen, I'm going to keep taking these things away from you until you learn to put me first, until you learn to not value these worldly friendships as much. You need to stop valuing them so much. And that was how I understood that event as happening. Like, why did it happen? Because God was punishing me. There were positive things with this too, just as a general, like viewing God as an actor, ever present. I can remember looking at sunsets. I really liked looking at sunsets as a kid. I still do. But I would imagine that God was right there painting, I guess you could say, the sky in real time for the enjoyment of his creation. Overall, just to sum up, I viewed the world as a place where every action, every event, every person had some sort of divine secret meaning, generally to teach you something and generally in the form of punishment. So next, my relationship with other people and how that was impacted by religion. And this is the area that is a little bit more mixed. There was some real conflict here between the religious way of approaching relationships with other people and you could call it a non-religious or just more self-assertive, self-preserving way of approaching relationships. I had the religious ideal for relationships, and then I had some pushback in terms of self-preservation, but it was very mixed. So on the religious vein, I was generally a people pleaser, ingratiating, but specifically with my teachers and other adults outside of the family that I looked up to. I was also recklessly naive and gullible with strangers and with my interaction with animals. So that was the side with the influence from religion. On the other side, I was incredibly rebellious and stubborn and self-assertive with my family and with peers at school and like my extended family, which was the more non-religious or self-assertive way of interacting. So there was this back and forth, the religious ideal on the one side, which was self-destructive, the sacrifice for others, the people-pleasing, the ingratiating yourself, not standing up for yourself. And then that was coming head to head with the more self-assertive, self-preserving side, where I did want to think for myself and stand up for myself and expect respect from other people and demand respect from other people. And so there are a couple examples here I can give you that really show this clash. I can remember being scolded by teachers at school for saying that there were things or people that I hated, because obviously it's not Christian to hate things, not morally good to hate people or to hate things, even if they're cruel and vicious. You were supposed to love everyone, even if they were cruel and vicious. Never mind that this actually destroys the entire concept and meaning of love, and it becomes entirely meaningless if you say you love everyone, including horrible, cruel, vicious, evil people, but who cares? You're not supposed to hate people. So I never bought into this. I was never able, despite all of the impact of religion, I never bought into the idea that it was somehow morally wrong to hate certain people or certain things. But I can remember being scolded for that. I can also remember being scolded for having commented that, I'll be nice to people if they're nice to me. Because obviously, again, that is completely morally wrong, despite the fact that that's actually just. That if people treat you poorly, that responding with kindness is not, and letting them walk all over you is not just. That's not just to you. But in Christianity, of course, you're supposed to turn the other cheek. You're supposed to let people walk all over you. So I remember I was scolded for expressing that opinion. On the flip side, because this was a clash, I was really struggling with these two different ways of approaching relationships. My parents were very worried, very concerned, and tried a lot to discourage me from being so gullible and being so naive, having so much faith in other people and not having any concern for my own safety or being taken advantage of. And so I was going two different directions and being pulled two different directions. I was really mixed here. I had this self-debasing, self-ingratiating kind of influence and also a more self-assertive, self-preserving influence. I was really mixed. So finally we have my relationship with myself. If you haven't guessed, it was negative. I started with negative self-talk incredibly early, and it was all focused on God, on sin and guilt and shame with God at a very, very young age, probably around 8 or 9. I can remember there being a devotion in 3rd or 4th grade that was absolutely devastating to me. The gist of it was that it was wrong to ask God for forgiveness multiple times for the same thing because you were making God sad, because you weren't trusting that he was forgiving you. And I remember sitting in class and hearing that and being utterly devastated because I was like, that's me, that's what I do. I cry myself to sleep at night feeling so guilty, asking God for forgiveness for the same thing over and over again, night after night. That's what I do. God is so sad that I have to keep asking him for forgiveness. So judging by the impact that that devotion had in 3rd or 4th grade, I'm able to kind of date the negative self-talk that I had, which is around 8 years old. It took a long time for it to evolve into a general feeling of my general capacity in any way to be good, but it started out as God and not being good enough morally. And eventually, once I was much older, it was like not smart enough, not pretty enough, not good enough in any capacity, in any way of life. But the way it started was with this view of guilt and sin and shame. I want to add that I'm not saying Christianity caused my depression. I think it's possible, maybe even likely, that I would have been depressed regardless. I don't think it would have started at 8 years old, and I definitely think it was a contributing factor. By the time I was in high school, I was extremely depressed, anxious, just an utter complete mess. I would say that it's a logical consequence of the doctrines of original sin and needing God's grace because of your depravity, and all of these kind of doctrines lend very logically to negative self-talk and depression. The last thing to really mention about my childhood has to do with the questions or doubts. Since this is a video about how I eventually came to reject Christianity, I think that's really relevant. So like I said, at school the Bible was taught alongside all of the other subjects and just as matter of fact as the other subjects. So at the same time I was learning about the planets and habitats of birds and the principles of the founding father and the structure of grammar in the English language, I was learning about the origin of the earth and the history of the Israelites. I had no concept that religious information was any different from the rest. And I loved learning. I loved books, and the Bible being a book kind of lent itself respect to me because I really liked learning from books. I knew eventually that there were people who weren't Christian, who believed in evolution, but to me, being a Christian meant being a fundamentalist, and I really had no concept of not being a fundamentalist and not taking the Bible literally. There was one thing, however, sparked from the Bible itself that really captured my imagination and I think was a spark of learning to question things and think about things for the first time. So I can remember learning about Gideon and the fleece. If you're not familiar with this story, and I don't remember all of the specifics, but Gideon has a question for God and he lays out a fleece of wool overnight and puts a stipulation to God saying, God, if this is what you want me to do, or if this is the right thing, then you make it so that the dew is only on the fleece and not on the ground around it. And then it happens. And then Gideon is still not fully convinced, which is interesting. And he asks for the next night, he says, all right, now do it the reverse. Make dew be all over the ground, but no dew on the fleece, if this is really, really what you want me to do. And it comes to pass. And so this was a revelation in my mind. You could ask him for direct evidence of what he wanted or what you should do, and he would put evidence in the real world that you could see. This was mind-blowing to me, and I set to work immediately doing my own version of Gideon and the fleece. I can remember setting out like a little chapstick tube by my bed at night and saying, God, if you're real, and then I would pick different tests to do, and I tried a whole bunch. I was like, make the chapstick be under my bed when I woke up in the morning, or take the cap off, or make it disappear entirely. Obviously, of course, nothing ever happened. And I was confused and disappointed about this, at least until I learned that you're not supposed to test God. You have like the story in the New Testament of Jesus being tempted in the desert and Satan tries to get him to test God, and you learn that, you're not supposed to test God. And so then I was like, oh, well, I guess that's why God never did anything with the chapstick, because it was actually I was in the wrong. Yet again, my horrible, sinful, depraved nature, I was in the wrong again, and I was trying to test God, and that's why he didn't respond. Why Gideon gets away with it, I don't know, but I shouldn't test God. But I thought that was an interesting thing that occurred in my childhood, where I did have some inkling of wanting to figure out if this was actually real, since you have no physical representation that this is real. So after this, I went to a public high school, and after a couple years, I started dating Douglas, who is now my husband, and that's where things get a little bit interesting, because he is a Catholic. And that was a huge deal. The one denomination that I knew about, aside from like my Baptist family and my Calvinist school, was Catholics. And family did not like Catholics. The view was these were bad Christians. They prayed to Mary instead of God, which is incredibly sacrilegious. They baptize babies, which just undermines the whole idea of freely choosing God and freely choosing to go to hell or not. They also have this weird servile dependence on the priest and complete lack of a mental independence. They just memorize little phrases and say them in unison instead of actually reading the Bible for themselves. This was the view that I had, that my family had, of Catholics. So you can imagine that when Douglas and I started talking about these things and having arguments about these things, we were a little bit heated at times. On the other side, they weren't fundamentalists. Catholics aren't fundamentalists. And Douglas was definitely shocked to discover that anyone would believe the fundamentalist things. And so we had discussions about these things, and I really began to think for the first time about what I had been taught and, whether any of it actually made any sense. At the same time, because of our ongoing discussions and our interest in this topic in general, we started watching this TV show called The Naked Archaeologist. The whole premise of the show was looking at different Bible stories and trying to see if there were any naturalistic phenomena that could explain the stories in the Bible. But the premise was that, obviously, the mystical and supernatural explanations don't have any basis. But could there be a naturalistic explanation that was then later the supernatural explanation was tacked onto? It was a really interesting idea and kind of contributed to this whole environment of questioning the validity of taking the Bible literally. And so, I came to the conclusion that taking the Bible literally did not make any sense. Snakes don't talk. You don't put a staff into water and part the sea. People don't die and then come back to life. Spirits don't impregnate people. These things are not a part of reality. There's no evidence in reality that anything like this could ever happen. That's not how the world works. Then, of course, there were the more controversial items like the Big Bang and evolution. And so thinking about these things and concluding as well that yes, it does not make sense for the earth to be only 6,000 years old. It does not make sense for there to be Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden with dinosaurs. So at this point in my life, I was basically trying to uproot all of the fundamentalism. I still had respect for the Bible, I still had reverence for the Bible, but I now had more of a view that, well, the stories are just stories. They might contain philosophical truth or truth about God, but not literal truth in the actual progression of the story. Implicit behind all of this was the idea that it was wrong to believe things based on faith, that you need to have evidence, solid evidence, real evidence in reality for the things that you believed. This was not explicit. I did not know that this was kind of the operating principle until much later, but it was implicit. Even with the Jesus story, I was coming to the view of a more naturalistic version. I was more uncomfortable with questioning that particular story because it's kind of the essence of Christianity. But I was toying with the idea that Jesus dying for your sins was the essential part, and what theological significance really was there in him rising from the dead 3 days later. Obviously, that can't actually happen, but it isn't even really necessary for the theology, and I wasn't convinced that it was. And then on top of that, I didn't understand why it was necessary theologically for Jesus to be the literal Son of God, where some invisible spirit is impregnating a woman against all the facts of reality. I didn't understand why God could not just have chosen Jesus to be his son, to be his representative on earth, in the same way that God chose the Israelites to be his chosen people. So I was coming to a more naturalistic view of even the Jesus story at this time. So then towards the end of high school, another really pivotal thing happened, which was that Douglas and I read Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. And this book is incredible. It was mind-blowing and just explosive in all kinds of ways. Pro-capitalism, pro-reason, pro-egoism, pro-reality, and it was just incredible. But I was really challenged by the atheism and the explicit rejection of Christianity and altruism, and I really didn't know how to process it. I really wanted to combine the two. I wanted a compromise between the two. It's not actually possible, but that is where I was at. I had this ideal of the rationally selfish heroes of Ayn Rand's novels on one side, and then I had the joyous sacrifice hero of Jesus on the other, and I wanted to be both. I wanted to try and do both, and I was really caught in between these two ideals and very confused and didn't know how to process it. So then it was time for college, and I decided to go to a Christian university. I don't really remember exactly what inspired going to a Christian university. I think it had mostly to do with the fact that I wanted to go to someplace small, because I was a shy, awkward, who am I kidding? I'm still shy and awkward person, and I was very intimidated by like the typical college experience of drinking and partying and just the general debauchery that you think of with the college experience. And so I wanted something smaller, something more community-like. So yeah, I decided to go to a Christian university. And this was a huge pendulum shift in my experience with Christianity. This was my first experience with the trendy, virtue signaling kind of Christianity. I had a community for the first time. I was very quickly on fire, as the kids like to say, for Jesus. This is a place where you eat, sleep, breathe Jesus. It was also like my first experience with a more positive kind of emotional experience with Christianity. Obviously, still guilt. You cannot get away from the absolute soul-crushing guilt that is Christianity. But there was now also more of a focus on love and forgiveness and being uplifted and encouraged. And I was on fire. I was planning out my life. I was going to join the Peace Corps. I was going to, of course, adopt all the poor children from the developing world. I was studying to be a special education teacher. And it wasn't just the future. I was trying to live out these ideals in the present as well. I was volunteering at all kinds of things, homeless shelters, Sunday school, Bible studies. I was working at church camps in the summer. I went on mission trips. I even I was really on fire. Okay, listen. I donated an organ to a stranger because God called me to do that. I had a relationship with God where I was constantly on the lookout for the little nudges to tell you what to do, how to serve people. I read the Bible, I prayed, I was baptized for the first time. This was an all-consuming emotional high experience. And this hyper-Christian phase, I would say, lasted a solid year, maybe a year and a half before it really, really started to cool off. And I started to take my questions and doubts more seriously and come to some actual conclusions. At the same time that I was going through all this hyper-emotional Christian high, I was also taking a lot of philosophy classes and biblical study classes. I even switched minors periodically. I was really interested in those classes because I really was like an intellectual type of person. I was really interested in ideas. I was fascinated by the work of exegesis and the research and the persuasive writing. I was really pulled in by the idea, especially, of there being a correct, right interpretation of a passage in the Bible. This goes against the grain of Protestantism, really, in general, where the idea is you, as an individual, uneducated though you may be, can read the Bible yourself and God will tell you how you're supposed to interpret it and what message you're supposed to be getting from it. Forget the fact that there's an actual author of the book or the chapter that you're reading. He had an intent. He had a linguistic context that you were 3 or 4, who knows how many languages removed from. He had a cultural context. He was living in a part of the world and a culture completely, utterly foreign to yours, living thousands of years prior to this point in time. And so I really came to the idea that it was just sheer audacity to think that you, as an uneducated person, was going to read this and really come away with any objective or reasonable interpretation without knowing any of that context. So I was doing this kind of intellectual work that I found really stimulating. I was also attending Catholic services for the first time, and I was just, the estimate of Catholicism in my mind was rising because they're just so much more intellectual and scholastic than Protestants. And so I had already concluded, like I said at this point, that the Bible wasn't literally true, and I was trying to come up with more naturalistic explanations for even some of the most essential components of Christianity. But this study and this thinking about the writers and the compiling of the Bible itself by the early church leaders really led me to conclude that even the divine inspiration idea did not have much meaning or any basis in reality. I really came to the conclusion that these books of the Bible were written by primitive peoples in the Middle East who were living in a pre-philosophic, pre-science society and were trying to explain the things around them in the only way they knew how, which was a mystical and supernatural way. For us in the modern world, when we do have philosophy and we do have science, and we can look at the external world and compare it with what this says, and find that it is completely out of touch with reality, there is some moral guilt if you continue to insist on a very primitive outlook. concurrently with all of this, I was learning about all the different denominations and their different answers to other theological questions like original sin and predestination and hell, and how exactly you reconcile free will with God ordaining everything to happen and having a plan for everything. But without the Bible as the foundation, because it doesn't make any sense for it to be a foundation of fact or truth, there's no way to decide between any of these theological arguments. It all goes back to having faith without evidence or opposed to evidence. So there's no real way to choose between any of the denominations. How do you validate their ideas when you can't use evidence from your senses, you can't use evidence from reason, and you only have faith? Well, they're all telling you to have faith. They tell you to have faith in this direction or in that direction. There's no real way to decide. At the same time, I was becoming really disenchanted, disillusioned, I guess you could say, with the hyper-Christian lifestyle. I was told by people that it was dangerous to learn things and it was better to stay ignorant, specifically talking about like science, because the more you learn, the more likely it would be for you to reject Christianity. But really, what does it say about your belief system if ignorance is the preferred state, where questioning things, where thinking about things, where using your mind is a threat to your belief system? Listen. That tells you a lot. That's all I gotta say. And then I was really disturbed by the complete lack of concern for whether the supposed help that you were giving to poor people, whether it actually helped or not, and whether you were not more concerned about feeling really good about yourself and like you're some savior swooping in and helping, the poor people who just can't think for themselves and can't make anything better for their life on their own. I was just really disgusted by the condescending way that Christians would try to help the poor people, when really it seemed much more about making themselves feel like the virtuous, good saviors who were so smart and could really fix everything, without even caring that most of the things, if not all of the things that you did to help, were either not helping in the best case, but were actively harming and just making things worse in a lot of cases. I was just increasingly repulsed by this way of interacting with other people and with the world. Eventually, I came to a double conclusion. It really marked the end of my life as a Christian. First, I came to the conclusion that it was wrong, morally, factually, wrong to believe things without evidence, to believe things based on faith, which that's what believing things based on faith means. It means believing things absent any evidence or in direct opposition to evidence that is contrary. It's wrong to believe a snake talked to a person and tempted a person, because snakes don't talk. It's wrong to believe that a person died and came back to life 3 days later. That's not how death works. And just, on and on and on. It's wrong to believe a bush can burn without burning. That's not how fire works. It's wrong to believe that a thought, you issuing a command to the universe, can make water turn to wine or part a sea. If you don't have enough information to explain something, it's not reasonable to make up stories and what ifs. That's not the reasonable way to go about things. If you don't know something, you look for an answer for sure. You know that there's a natural explanation for everything in reality, and you don't make up stories. That's not reasonable. That's not objective. The other conclusion, it went like this. Let's say that I'm wrong. Let's say that the Christian God is the real God. The Bible is true, and you should believe it. Let's say I'm wrong about those things. Well, I decided that even if I was wrong, I would rather spend a torment of eternity in hell than follow that God. This God, under this creed, set everything into motion, controls everything, and knows every decision a person is going to make. This God who then intervenes and hardens people's hearts and causes people to misunderstand things. This God who gives his message of salvation as a contradictory, helter-skelter thing that is the Bible, that is so difficult to interpret, and yet your salvation, Your life in eternity depends upon it. This God who supposedly gives you free will to act, free will to choose him or not, but this God who also has a plan for everything and knew what you were going to do and planned for you to do what you were going to do ahead of time, which in effect means you don't have free will. But yet, you have enough free will, he's going to act as if you have free will so that he can send you to hell for an eternity if you didn't choose what he wanted you to. He didn't believe the message that he gave you in such a contradictory way. This God who would punish you for the depravity that he gave you. I decided that if this was justice, if this is what the God was, I wanted no part of it. I would rather be in hell, separated from him forever, suffering, than have to spend an eternity with that kind of God. And I want to be really clear on this because I've had conversations with people in the past and they'll be like, oh, you're so kind-hearted and sweet. You just can't bear the thought of God sending people to hell. Like, what a kind-hearted, naive, gullible person. Like, there has to be justice. Like, some people just deserve it. Like, don't you understand? Like, I know this breaks your heart. And I'm like, no. I'm fine with the idea of justice. This is just not justice. This is not justice. This is, in fact, the exact opposite of justice. Punishing people who have no choice is not justice. Making their salvation dependent on knowledge that you obscure is not justice. So with these two conclusions, the idea that it was wrong to believe something based on faith and that I would spurn this God even if I happen to be wrong, I was officially no longer a Christian. I will just add that at this point in my life, I have a much more fleshed out argument or conclusion about exactly how evil the Christian doctrine is, and the doctrine of hell is just the tip of the iceberg, but that's not really the point of this video, so I'm not really going to dwell on it here because that fleshed out version wasn't the reason I rejected Christianity in the first place. So what next? Because of my view on faith and how it was wrong to believe things based on faith, I wasn't tempted to join any other religion once I got rid of Christianity. By what reason or what evidence would I choose any of the others? Whether it's Islam or Judaism, Buddhism, Hinduism, they all ultimately rely on the same thing, on faith. And so that was outside of the province of an option. Same thing with the pagan or secular versions of religion, like no witches, no ghosts, no astrology, or any of the other completely faith-based but secular religions that some people turn to when they leave Christianity. I wanted to reject Christianity at its essence. And one of the essences of Christianity, the epistemological essence, is the reliance on faith for knowledge. It made no sense to me to reject Christianity and then just go to another religion. It's like you have a junk car and you just put on a new coat of paint and then think you have a new car. You don't have a new car. If you were raised Christian and you're now some hippy-dippy Buddhist or pagan witch, there's literally, in essence, epistemologically, no difference between you and a Christian. And I wanted to reject it at its essence. So those were out. I mean, philosophically, I was interested in the ideas of different religions, but as philosophy. And since most of their conclusions in ethics are based ultimately on some sacred text or another, it kind of loses its weight. So I looked into other philosophies. I looked at existentialism, nihilism, deism, stoicism, just because I was interested in ideas in general. At that point, I would have considered myself a deist, which basically believes that there is some sort of consciousness, some sort of creator that set the world into motion, but is not operative and acting in the world afterwards. It creates the world and then it backs away. And the only reason I really was convinced by this, or at least couldn't be convinced by atheism at the time, was because I couldn't understand how the universe could come to exist without there being something prior. Like something from nothing logically does not make sense. So I was really philosophically hung up on that for a really long time. Really toyed with like some Stoicism and Taoism for a while. My husband, he's also very philosophical and much more philosophically creative than I am. And so he had kind of come up with his own, you could call it religion or philosophy, based a lot on deism and Stoicism and Taoism. And so we were toying with those ideas for a while, but I would say towards the end, like in the most recent past couple years, I was atheist in all but name. I wasn't very comfortable calling myself an atheist, mostly because still I didn't have the answer to the cosmological argument. I didn't know how to process that. So last year, over a year ago at this point, we found the book Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand by Leonard Peikoff, affectionately called OPAR. This presented the entire philosophy of objectivism, which is the philosophy of the author who wrote Atlas Shrugged, the book that had blown our minds way back in high school. And it actually had an answer to the cosmological argument and had a reason for being atheistic. And it made a lot of sense. They had principles for not believing things without evidence. They had a validation of the senses. And so I was very easily then able to conclude, well, there is no evidence in reality for this omniscient, omnipotent creator consciousness. So I was able to become an atheist. I will say that though they do have an answer for the cosmological argument, I don't fully understand it as yet. It's something I'm working on understanding. I'm not fully there yet, so I wouldn't do it justice right now. Now that I have even more principled stance on faith and on validating the senses, I feel completely comfortable saying, yeah, I'm an atheist. You need positive evidence to believe that there's this omniscient creator. So at this point, I'm very grateful that I rejected Christianity. I have a lot of feelings, right? I feel angry about my childhood and how harmful it was to me cognitively and emotionally, and I'm still dealing with the effects and having to work through the vestiges of the way that I approached people and the world and myself. But I'm really grateful that I went through the work to do it, and that I'm still doing the work to use my mind fruitfully rather than destructively, and pursuing knowledge based on evidence and reason and my senses. I'm just glad I came out on the other side much happier, much more fulfilled, much more confident in my ability to succeed, knowing that I'm in control of my life, or at least, the essential parts of life, the things that matter, that I get to create my own meaning and forge my own path with the work of my hands and the effort of my reasoning mind. It's phenomenal. I'm curious to know about your spiritual journey. Were you raised religiously? Were some of your experiences similar to mine, different from mine? I'd be really curious to know. Please let me know in the comments below, and thanks for watching. Bye for now.